Hello, welcome back to our channel, where we explore the deepest and most terrifying mysteries of the world. Today, we have content that will chill even the bravest souls. We're diving into real and supernatural stories that have happened and continue to happen in cemeteries. These are accounts of sinister shadows, malevolent presences, and paranormal encounters that defy all logical explanations. Get ready to hear stories that will stir your mind and heart. From visions of spectral figures to frightening premonitions, these episodes will leave you questioning everything you think you know about life and death. Story 1: The Graveyard Doll. Anna was a young woman with an adventurous spirit, fascinated by stories of abandoned places filled with mysteries. On one of her nighttime explorations, she and a group of friends decided to visit a long-forgotten cemetery on the outskirts of the city. The place was covered in a dense fog and surrounded by twisted trees whose branches resembled skeletal hands. Among ancient tombs and cracked headstones, something caught her attention: a porcelain doll partially buried, wearing a white dress stained with time. Without a second thought, Anna picked up the doll. It was impeccably preserved, with glass eyes that seemed to follow her. Feeling a strange connection to the object, Anna decided to take it home, ignoring the chills down her spine and the murmurs from her friends about not messing with the dead's belongings. That night, Anna placed the doll on her shelf alongside other items from her adventures. But something felt wrong. She sensed a dark presence in the room, as if she were being watched. As days passed, the atmosphere in her house grew heavier. Anna began having disturbing nightmares, where a girl with long black hair and sad eyes begged for her doll. Nights became a torment. The sounds of footsteps echoed in empty hallways, doors slammed shut on their own, and cold whispers filled the air. Anna started finding the doll in different places around the house, even though she was sure she had left it on the shelf. Each time the doll moved, its face seemed more expressive, as if it were coming to life. Desperate, Anna decided to investigate the cemetery's history and discovered that the doll belonged to a girl named Isabella, who had died under mysterious circumstances. Isabella was known for being very attached to the doll, her only companion in a life marked by loneliness. Feeling the weight of guilt and growing fear, Anna decided to return the doll to the cemetery, hoping it would bring peace to Isabella's restless soul. On the night Anna went to the cemetery, the environment was even more sinister. The fog was thick, and the full moon cast a spectral light on the tombstones. She found Isabella's grave, now identified by a cracked headstone with the name almost erased. Placing the doll where she found it, Anna felt a chill run down her spine. She murmured an apology and turned to leave. Then she heard a child's laughter. Turning slowly, Anna saw the spectral figure of a girl beside the grave. Isabella stood there, with a dirty white dress and glassy eyes. She smiled at Anna, a smile that seemed to thank but also threaten. In a swift movement, the figure disappeared, leaving only the echo of her laughter in the air. Anna ran out of the cemetery, her heart racing. But when she got home, she noticed something terrifying. The doll was back on the shelf, with a satisfied expression on its face. Since that night, Anna has been haunted by Isabella's presence. The girl appears in reflections, whispers her name in the dark, and leaves the doll in unexpected places. Anna lives in constant fear that at any moment, Isabella might come to take her to the world of the dead. And so the story of Anna and the graveyard doll remains an unsolved mystery, a warning that some things should be left alone. After all, between our world and the spiritual, there are forces we do not understand, and spirits that never rest. Story 2: The Dead Man's Ring. Carlos was always a fearless young man, known among his friends as someone who loved exploring dark and mysterious places. On a particularly cold and foggy night, he and his group of friends decided to visit an old cemetery famous for ghost legends. It was a place of eternal rest for many who were said to have died violent and mysterious deaths. The tombstones were old and neglected, covered in moss, with inscriptions almost erased by time. As they walked among the graves, something shiny caught Carlos's attention. On the ground, next to a broken headstone, he found a golden ring, incredibly well preserved. The piece seemed to glow with its own light, even in the night's darkness. Ignoring his friend's warnings not to touch anything from the cemetery, Carlos picked up the ring and, without thinking twice, put it on his finger. At that moment, he felt a strange sensation of power and euphoria, as if the ring belonged to him. However, the atmosphere around him changed. The air felt colder, and an oppressive feeling settled over everyone. They decided to leave the cemetery quickly, but Carlos couldn't stop looking at the ring. He was enchanted, unaware that the object carried an ancient and dangerous curse. In the following days, Carlos began to experience disturbing visions. Whenever he looked at the ring, flashes of horrifying scenes appeared in his mind: a man being brutally murdered in an old mansion, surrounded by indistinct shadows. The visions became increasingly vivid until Carlos recognized the crime scene as an old abandoned mansion in the city. Determined to learn more about the ring, he went to the mansion, which had been uninhabited and in ruins for a long time. There, Carlos found old documents revealing the story of a wealthy and powerful man named Ricardo, who lived there in the 19th century. Ricardo was known for his fortune and for owning a ring said to have supernatural properties, granting luck and protection. However, the story took a dark turn when Ricardo was brutally murdered in his own home. According to records, the crime was committed by his brother Antonio, who wanted to claim Ricardo's fortune. Antonio, consumed by greed, tried to take the ring but mysteriously died that same night, and the ring disappeared. Since then, the mansion and the cemetery where Ricardo was buried were avoided by the locals, who believed the ring was cursed. Obsessed with the ring, Carlos began to notice that he was being pursued by a shadowy figure. Each night, the presence grew stronger, and he heard murmurs of accusation as if Ricardo sought revenge for his death. The ring, which once seemed like a valuable item, now became an unbearable burden. He tried to remove it, but it seemed to be stuck to his finger as if fused with his skin. Desperate, Carlos decided to return to the cemetery to try and undo what he had done. That night, the fog was thick, and the wind howled as if the dead were whispering dark secrets. Upon arriving at Ricardo's grave, he began to feel a searing pain in his finger as if the ring was burning his flesh. Suddenly, a spectral figure appeared before him. It was Ricardo, with an expression of hate and pain. He extended his hand, demanding the ring's return. In a desperate act, Carlos managed to remove the ring and place it on the headstone. Ricardo took the ring, and with a grim smile, began to fade away. But before disappearing completely, he muttered, "Now you know what happens to those who mess with the dead." Carlos, relieved to be rid of the ring, took a step back, but the ground beneath his feet gave way, and he fell into a crevice that opened, falling forever into the darkness. The next day, his friends found him missing, and the ring was back in its original position on the ground beside Ricardo's headstone, intact. Since then, the ring remains there, waiting for its next bearer. Carlos's story has become a local legend, a warning to all who think of meddling with what they shouldn't. Between our world and the dead's, there are things we don't understand and forces we shouldn't challenge. Story 3: The Flower of Death. Clara had always been fascinated by rare and exotic plants. Her small garden was filled with species she had collected over the years, each with a unique story. One day, while exploring an old trail in a nearby forest, she heard about an abandoned cemetery known for its unusual flowers. Intrigued, she decided to visit the place, hoping to find something to add to her collection. The cemetery was a place forgotten by time. The gravestones were covered in moss, and many had crumbled. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the very air was infused with sadness. Clara walked among the tombs, feeling a strange unease, but continued her search. It was then that she found a peculiar plant growing at the foot of an old grave. It was a unique flower with deep blue petals she had never seen before. Without hesitation, Clara carefully dug it up and took it home. Upon arrival, she planted the flower in a special pot and placed it in her living room, admiring its unusual beauty. However, from the moment she brought it home, Clara began to notice strange changes around her. The house, once vibrant and colorful, became dark and oppressive. The plants in her garden started to wither, as if the new flower was draining the life around it. At night, Clara had vivid and disturbing dreams. In her dreams, she saw a sad and pale woman dressed in old-fashioned clothes, crying by a grave. The woman held a bouquet of blue flowers, the same Clara had found. Clara felt a deep pain and an inexplicable emptiness, as if she was connected to the woman's suffering. Each time she woke up, the flower seemed more vibrant, as if it were absorbing the energy from her dreams. Determined to uncover the origin of the plant, Clara returned to the cemetery and researched the name on the gravestone where she had found it. She discovered that the grave belonged to a young woman named Maria, who had tragically passed away in the 19th century. Maria was known for her love of flowers, especially blue ones, which she cultivated with dedication. Clara found an old diary in a local library that revealed Maria had been promised in marriage to a cruel man who imprisoned her in her own home. Maria tended her flowers as an escape from reality, but in an act of desperation, she took her own life. The blue flowers were her only companions in her final days. As days passed, Clara noticed the flower growing rapidly, more than usual. She tried to get rid of the plant, but every time she removed it, it reappeared in the pot. The presence of the plant became unbearable, and Clara began to feel that something was watching her. Strange occurrences began to happen, doors opening and closing by themselves, whispering voices echoing through the house, and shadows passing at the edge of her vision. Clara decided she needed to return the plant to the cemetery, hoping this would free her from the dark influence. On a cold and rainy night, she went back to Maria's grave with the plant. As she dug to replant it, she felt a strong gust of wind and heard a distant wailing sound. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Clara tried to leave, but was pushed back by an invisible force. She fell, and the plant fell from her hands, burying itself in the earth. At that moment, a spectral figure appeared before her. It was Maria, with tears streaming down her face, but her gaze was filled with anger. She looked directly at Clara, who felt an indescribable fear take over her body. Maria extended her hand, and the blue flower began to glow intensely. Clara screamed, trying to get up, but her body was paralyzed. Maria's figure began to dissipate, and the blue flower burned in a cold bluish flame. Clara was never seen again after that night. The next day, her friends found only her car parked near the cemetery and the blue flower growing at Maria's grave, with a new inscription, "Here lies Maria, who found peace beside her beloved flowers." Since then, the legend of the flower of death spread, and the cemetery was completely abandoned. It is said that anyone who takes a flower from that place is destined to suffer the same fate as Clara, as some things should remain in the realm of the dead. There are inexplicable and malevolent forces guarding the cemetery, and those who challenge these forces pay a terrible price. Story 4: The Executioner's Medallion. Pedro was always a skeptical young man, uninterested in superstitions or horror stories. He only believed in what he could see and touch. On a cold night, he and some friends decided to visit an old cemetery famous for the legend of an executioner who haunted the living. The cemetery, shrouded in fog and silence, exuded a dark and heavy atmosphere, as if the dead were watching the visitors. While walking among the gravestones, one of them caught Pedro's attention. It was larger than the others and carved with a dark figure, a hooded man with an axe in hand. At the foot of the gravestone, Pedro found a black iron medallion decorated with a symbol of a flaming axe. Without thinking twice, he picked up the object, ignoring his friend's warnings about not touching anything from the cemetery. That night, Pedro took the medallion home, thinking it was just an interesting souvenir. However, from the moment he put it in his pocket, strange things began to happen. The air around him seemed colder, and shadows danced on the walls of his room. Pedro started to hear indistinct whispers, as if someone was trying to talk to him. Every time he looked at the medallion, a feeling of discomfort and fear grew inside him. The next night, Pedro had a terrible nightmare. He was in a medieval square, surrounded by a crowd shouting and cheering. In the center of the square, an executioner in a hood was preparing for an execution. The executioner, a tall and sinister figure, wore a black cloak and held a giant axe. His presence emanated an aura of pure evil, as if hell itself was reflected in his eyes. The axe seemed to burn with a supernatural blue fire, and the executioner, with a rough and dark voice, murmured, "The justice of the dead knows no mercy." Pedro woke up in a cold sweat, feeling a sharp pain in his chest. Looking in the mirror, he noticed light burn marks on his skin, as if he had been touched by something very hot. Fear began to take hold of him. He tried to convince himself that it was just a dream, but the bizarre events became increasingly intense. Objects moved by themselves, and he heard heavy footsteps echoing through the house. Desperate, Pedro began to research the medallion and the cemetery. He discovered that the grave belonged to an old executioner, known for his cruelty. He had executed dozens of people, often for pleasure, and was known to use an axe that, according to legend, was cursed. The executioner had been lynched by an angry mob, but before he died, he promised revenge, swearing to return from the dead to punish those who disrespected his rest. Pedro decided to return the medallion to the cemetery, hoping to end the supernatural events. That night, he returned to the site, his heart pounding. The fog was thick, and a deathly silence reigned in the air. Upon reaching the executioner's tomb, Pedro felt a terrible presence around him. Suddenly, the medallion began to glow intensely, and the air filled with the smell of sulfur. The figure of the executioner appeared before Pedro, surrounded by blue flames. The executioner was a terrifying sight. His skin looked melted, as if burning eternally, and his eyes glowed with demonic fury. He raised the axe, which was also on fire, and advanced towards Pedro. Paralyzed with fear, Pedro tried to scream, but no sound came out of his mouth. At the last moment, the executioner stopped, staring at Pedro with a penetrating gaze. He whispered, "The punishment for the living is to live with the fear of the dead." Then, with a swift motion, the executioner vanished, leaving Pedro alone and terrified. The next morning, Pedro's friends found him lying near the tomb. He was as cold as ice, with a look of terror on his face, but with no visible signs of injury. Next to him, the medallion was broken into pieces. The doctors could not determine the exact cause of death, only that it appeared to have been a heart attack caused by extreme fear. Pedro's story became a local legend, a dark warning that some things should never be disturbed. Story 5: The Graveyard Janitor. Umberto was a simple, hard-working man known for his dedication to his job as a janitor at a large cemetery. For years, he had cleaned graves, swept fallen leaves, and ensured that the final resting places of many were always in order. He had always worked during the day, but that week, there was an unexpected change: the night shift. At first, he didn't mind, seeing the job as an opportunity to earn some extra money, especially after the recent death of his father, which had left him with an inexplicable void. That night, Umberto arrived at the cemetery under a starless sky, with the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The place, always calm during the day, seemed to have a different aura at night. The shadows of the trees swayed like ghostly figures, and the cold wind made a hissing sound as it passed through the gravestones. The cemetery was vast, with graves dating back centuries, many of which were covered in moss and almost forgotten. Umberto began his routine, cleaning gravestones and sweeping the paths. Around midnight, he decided to take a break for dinner. He sat down in a small maintenance room, an old and poorly lit structure where he kept his belongings. The security guard, an elderly man who was more interested in sleeping than patrolling, had already gone to his cabin, leaving Umberto alone. While eating, he heard something strange. A soft voice, almost a whisper, called his name, Umberto. He froze, looking around, but saw no one. The voice seemed to come from all directions, as if the wind was carrying the sound. He stood up and went to the door, looking out at the empty cemetery. Nothing. He decided to ignore it, thinking it might just be his mind playing tricks. After all, who would be calling him at that hour in a place like this? Returning to work, Umberto tried to concentrate, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave him. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the silence of the cemetery was oppressive. After a few hours, tired, he decided to sit in his chair and close his eyes for a few minutes. That was when something happened that he would never forget. In a semi-conscious state, Umberto had a lucid dream. In the dream, he was in the cemetery, but the environment was different. The air was thick, carrying a sharp smell of sulfur, and the sky was a deep red, as if it were on fire. Walking among the gravestones, he encountered a figure he immediately recognized: his father. The man was pale, with a sorrowful expression. He extended his hand to Umberto, showing a mark on his wrist, a scar Umberto remembered from his childhood. "You shouldn't be here, son," said his father, with a voice echoing from a very distant place. Suddenly, the scene changed. Umberto was in a dark, cold place, with stone walls and a deadly silence. In the center of the room, a huge iron gate with strange symbols was ajar. From there, a pale and cold light emanated, and Umberto felt a malevolent presence on the other side. He knew instinctively that it was a portal to another world, a place of pain and suffering. His father, now with a look of despair, tried to close the gate, but something prevented him. From inside the portal, a monstrous figure appeared, a creature with black, scaly skin, glowing red eyes, and flames coming out of its mouth. It was the executioner, the guardian of the dead, an infernal entity destined to punish lost souls. The creature laughed, a laugh that echoed throughout the space, and looked directly at Umberto. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice sounding like 1,000 intertwined screams. "This is the place of the dead, and now you are one of them." Umberto tried to scream, but no sound came out. He felt an unbearable pain in his chest, as if something was being torn from him. He looked at his father, who only shook his head, as if asking for forgiveness. Umberto woke up with a start, sweating and with his heart racing. The cemetery was dark and silent as before, but he felt something had changed. He stood up, still trembling, and looked at the clock. It was almost 3 in the morning. He tried to calm himself, telling himself it was just a nightmare, but his father's and the executioner's words echoed in his mind. The next day, Umberto was found dead in the maintenance room by the security guard. His expression was one of pure terror, with wide-open eyes and an open mouth, as if he had seen something beyond human comprehension. On his wrist, a mark in the shape of a scar that no one could explain. The doctors could not determine the exact cause of death, only that it seemed to have been a heart attack. But those who knew the cemetery's story whispered about the legend of the executioner, the guardian of the dead, who protected the portal between our world and hell. And so the cemetery returned to its usual quietness, but with a new name on the list of those who should never have meddled with the secrets of the dead. Between heaven and hell, there are things we cannot understand, forces beyond our comprehension. And those who dare to challenge these forces may end up encountering something much worse than death. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to help us continue bringing more terrifying and mysterious stories. And remember, between heaven and hell, there are things we cannot understand. Thank you for joining us on this journey. May love and faith always guide your steps, even in the darkest moments.